Hey everyone, Nick here, host of 4Player Podcast, and these are my 10 favorite games of 2024. Truth be told, I don't play many JRPGs these days. Despite that, I stepped outside my comfort zone a lot in 2024 by playing all the way through Persona 3 Reload, my very first Persona, I might add, but it was actually Metaphor ReFantazio that ended up having the biggest impact on me. Fans have been clamoring for Persona 6 for years now, yet this brand new fantasy IP from the same studio snuck up and filled that void. While it shares a lot of DNA with Persona, it replaces the high school drama with a very different kind of story entrenched in politics, racism, and rebellion in the face of tyranny. Honestly, it was kind of difficult to play as real-world politics started to burn our world to the fucking ground in 2024, but I digress. Despite its oppressive themes, the approach taken is definitely worth celebrating. They've recontextualized a lot of the systems that we commonly associate with Persona to fit within this new world, and smoothed out some of the rough edges to make a much smoother gameplay experience that fans will immediately recognize and appreciate. I'm not a Persona superfan or anything, but the changes definitely didn't go unnoticed even by me. Most notably, the flow of exploration and combat is remarkably fast, and a new pre-battle attack function allows you to skip the pomp and circumstance of turn-based battles once your party out-levels enemies within a specific dungeon, meaning a well-leveled party can blast through dungeons and quickly dispatch enemies, gain experience, and progress through the story without getting bogged down in the actual battle system itself. But make no mistake, that actual battle system interface and the pacing of those battles is also incredibly snappy, especially once you've grown accustomed to it. On top of that, it's built around this layered job system that provides a ton of freedom as to how you grow your characters and structure your party. Basically, Metaphor is perhaps one of the best feeling Persona games ever made. If Persona 6 doesn't take cues from this, I might skip it altogether, to be honest. With all that said, I really do think it's the world, the characters, and the central themes that landed this game on my list. It's about a diverse cast of characters living in an extremely prejudiced society who band together to take down a traitorous assassin and lift a curse on a young prince whom the whole world assumes is dead. A powerful spell cast by the king before his assassination forces the citizenry of the world to compete for the role of king, and a magic-infused worldwide election begins. To say more would spoil it, but I really can't overstate how interesting and refreshing the whole thing is, even if its overall structure doesn't feel quite as fresh as the world that surrounds it. I know it's not my usual fare, and I do get a lot of flack for appearing not to enjoy Japanese-developed games. I actually do, though. But not even I can deny that Metaphor ReFantazio was a force to be reckoned with in 2024. It barely made my list, yes, but I think it more than earned its praise by telling a super original story and raising the bar that Persona will now have to rise to meet or risk stagnation. What is it they say? A rising tide lifts all boats? Well, guys, Metaphor is most certainly that tide. Black Myth Wukong is another one of those games that was cooking for what felt like a decade. It had been in the oven for so long and looked so good in trailers that many of us, myself included, assumed it was too good to be true. I fully expected this game to be a stunningly beautiful but shallow and probably short action game. I was wrong. This game is stunningly beautiful, but it's also enormous in scope, meticulously crafted, and mechanically rich. This semi-sequel to China's famed literary work, Journey to the West, places you in the role of a descendant of Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, who played a major role in the original novel, as he sets out to find 6 relics that can be used to resurrect his ancestor. Along this renewed journey, you encounter various characters, creatures, and villains rooted in Chinese folklore, and of course, Journey to the West. And it's these depictions and interpretations that make Black Myth Wukong such a sight to behold. If I had to paint you a mental picture, it might not be much of a stretch to describe it as Dark Souls meets Ghost of Tsushima. The wildly imaginative interpretations of the mythology parallel the vibes that I get from Dark Souls, while the reverence for the culture and history of China is swept up into a beautiful presentation of something akin to Ghost of Tsushima. That probably would have been enough to capture people's attention, but they didn't stop there. I say that because Wukong features a deep, challenging, and rewarding combat system based around multiple fighting stances that can be switched on the fly during combat, all of which impact the flow and reach of your staff. Layered on top of that is an expansive skill tree, multiple actually, weapon upgrades, stat boost allocations, and a long list of unlockable transformations that provide powerful spells or attacks that can turn the tide of battle if used effectively. But at its core, it's a game that demands a mastery of the dodge and parry mechanics, like Sekiro, to claim victory against 80 plus unique and challenging boss fights. But calling this game a boss rush would be maybe a gross oversimplification, I think. The game spans 6 distinct, complex levels that each hide their own wealth of side quests and secrets. Believe me, my 80 plus hours with this game amounted to a lot more than just running a straight line from boss to boss. It's a beautifully realized world that is a ton of fun to explore. But I also want to take a second to shout out what I think might be the most unexpected aspect of Black Myth Wukong. Between each chapter, you're treated to an animated recreation of the previous chapter's mythology set to music. These transitions feature unique animation styles that range from stop-motion animation to Miyazaki-adjacent epics that are jaw-droppingly gorgeous. In short, it's a big game with a lot of depth and nuance and easily one of the best Souls-inspired character action games of the year, if not the generation. In all honesty, I have not finished Pacific Drive. In fact, far from it. There's always one. With that said, I'm fairly confident this game would rank even higher on my list if I had finished it, because what I have experienced thus far taps into the intense love that I now carry for the survival genre, but in a very unique way. After taking a detour through the woods in the Pacific Northwest, you find yourself suddenly teleported into the outer portion of the Olympic Exclusion Zone, a mysterious area quarantined by the government in the 60s due to unexplained phenomena. Shortly thereafter, you stumble across an abandoned station wagon before making radio contact with some scientists who are studying the zone from the inside. From that point forward, it's all about upgrading and maintaining this vehicle to help you learn the truth and ultimately escape the zone. Once you're past that somewhat elaborate setup for the game, you're given access to a garage which serves as your home base, and then set loose to venture into the various areas throughout the zone to scavenge for resources, research anomalies, and uncover the mysteries of the zone. Each time you return to the garage, you can research car modifications and upgrades, use diagnostic tools to pinpoint and fix various quirks that develop in your car, and ultimately better prepare yourself to venture further and further into the heart of the zone. But survival games are only as good as the carrots that they dangle in front of your face, and Pacific Drive perhaps is one of the best I've experienced thus far. The list of upgrades is extensive and overwhelming, but the challenges out in the zone are equally so. It's a world packed with dangerous weather anomalies, terrifying weeping angel-like enemies, and bizarre occurrences, so every modification feels like an important step in the right direction. But perhaps the most unique thing about this game is that in order to exit each level, you must collect special anchors throughout the world that, when triggered, create a gateway that your car must drive through to transport you back to the garage. But the gateway is only open for a limited amount of time, and the world around you is on the brink of collapse as you haul your ass across the map to get to the extraction point. It's wild and made for some of the most exciting moments of the year for me. But on a micro level, it's also a game obsessed with the tactile feel of operating a complex motor vehicle. Driving through rough terrain out in the zone, you have to turn the key to start the engine, pull the shifter into gear, turn your head to check the mirrors, and even interact with the switches to activate your headlights and windshield wipers. Forgetting any one of these things when you exit the car to explore on foot could lead you to drain the battery or even send your car rolling down a hill. It's punishing, but I can't help but respect the authenticity. Basically, this whole game, this whole experience, is designed to be atmospheric, intense, and at times terrifying, but also rewarding as hell. It's a game that's been on my mind since the first day I played it. In fact, I knew it was destined to be on this list almost immediately. I may not have finished it yet, but that hasn't kept it from being one of the most memorable and rewarding games of the year for me.
You sure took your time out there.
Few games evoke as much unadulterated joy as Astrobot. After its mind-blowing VR debut and an equally impressive tech demo packaged with the PS5, PlayStation's unofficial mascot character finally has its own fully-fledged release, simply titled Astrobot. For anyone still in doubt, make no mistake, Astrobot is PlayStation's answer to Super Mario. It's a game with an insane level of creativity, variety, and charm, anchored by some of the best third-person platforming on the market, Mario included. Seriously, it's not hyperbole to say that it quite literally takes seconds of controlling this character to understand its appeal and see its potential, and that potential is reached over the course of this jam-packed 20-hour love letter to the history of PlayStation. Imagine a spiritual successor to Super Mario Galaxy, where all of the planets are bursting at the seams with clever nods to PlayStation's long history, where all the stars are replaced with hidden bots dressed as hundreds of PlayStation's most iconic and in some cases obscure characters, where reaching the finale of each galaxy drops you into entire levels designed to pump PlayStation nostalgia straight into your veins. Am I being clear enough? This is any PlayStation fan's wet dream, but it's also so much more than that. Astrobot expands upon all that clever DualSense functionality that was introduced in Astro's Playroom, and then goes well beyond it, introducing a bunch of new unique abilities and upgrades that make the platforming in this game endlessly entertaining. But for those wanting to get a little bit more from the game, some genuine challenge if you will, there are plenty of optional collectibles and secrets to find that will require you to put your platforming skills to the test. One challenge level in particular still haunts me to this day. It probably took me 100 attempts, but I finally got it. At times, the game's got some genuine Trials HD energy, so take that how you will. As I'm sure you've probably noticed, I'm heaping a lot of praise on a game that sits fairly low in my top 10. It's not that I don't think this game is worthy of being christened Game of the Year. In fact, I'm really happy that it was by many publications. For me, it just came down to a certain amount of familiarity, and if I'm being honest, the lack of VR functionality. As amazing as this game actually is, I still think it's a little overshadowed by Rescue Mission, a VR game that was released way back in 2018. But seriously, don't let that sway you from playing this game. It remains one of the most creative and technically sound platformers ever made, and it's an undeniable highlight of 2024. If any game in 2024 softened the blow of yet another year without Hollow Knight Silksong, I would say it was Nine Souls. A stunning, hand-drawn 2D Metroidvania from Taiwan that blends Taoist philosophy with futuristic cyberpunk-esque elements. The result is something that feels visually unique and stands in stark contrast to Red Candle's past work. Seriously, take a look at their previous titles. Detention and Devotion were both about as far away from this as humanly possible, but make no mistake, Nine Souls earns its stripes in this undeniably crowded genre by relying on precision-based platforming, fast-paced tough-as-nails combat, and beautiful animated storytelling. Speaking of which, it tells an interesting tale about an alien civilization that discovered and enslaved the human race in a desperate attempt to save their people, and the repercussions of that decision hundreds of years later. It's a beautiful game that touches on some incredibly dark themes, but it also features a colorful cast of characters that manage to balance out that intensity by keeping things light. Honestly, it's also a lot like Hollow Knight in this way. You know, I could probably just sum this up by saying Hollow Knight fans will feel right at home with this game and move on. But I won't, because I do think it's more than that. I never really considered myself to be someone who seeks out challenging games specifically, so when I praise a game like Nine Souls, or Hollow Knight, or Elden Ring, or whatever, it's usually because the makeup of that game elevates it enough that I no longer consider the challenge to be a barrier to entry. It means that the feel of the game and the draw of exploring its world far surpasses the roadblocks that they've thrown at me, and that is exactly what I think Nine Souls excels at. The world's unique and mysterious aesthetic pulled me in and then gradually ratcheted up the complexity and danger, as any good Metroidvania should. I was hooked in minutes, but before long, I was pushing my abilities to the absolute limit, frequently dodging, parrying, dashing, and fighting back against aggressive enemies while trying my best to keep my footing in any number of delicate platforming obstacle courses. Not to mention the boss encounters, which will absolutely wipe the floor with you if you don't stay focused. But despite these obstacles, the world is littered with enough secrets, collectibles, and interesting bits of lore that it felt impossible to put down, even though, admittedly, I was occasionally tempted to do so. Quite frankly, it's a remarkable game that I think demands respect from the player, but more than earns its place among the greats within this genre. If that long wait for Silksong is still hurting, Nine Souls might be the medicine you've been waiting for, or in some cases, willfully ignoring. If that's you, rectify that mistake as quick as possible. To this day, the Stalker franchise occupies a pretty unique corner of the shooter genre. It has always sought to balance realistic gunplay and survival elements against supernatural horrors that have been layered on top of one of the most terrifying man-made disasters in history. At the same time, it's always been an incredibly finicky series, often requiring the player to overlook the rough edges and embrace the uneven flow of the game's narrative. Well, despite being developed by a whole new team at GSC Game World amidst the backdrop of an actual war, it seems that this franchise has successfully made the jump into the mainstream with the release of Stalker 2: Heart of Chernobyl. Don't get me wrong, the game is every bit as janky and obtuse as its predecessors, but with a much bigger budget, a much more ambitious approach to the world design, yet with a noticeable commitment to honoring the quirkiness that defined the series in the first place. Also, it's worth mentioning that it was basically unplayable at launch, which honestly threatened to push this game off of my list entirely. Luckily, the team remained committed to fixing the game's biggest issues, and I have since spent 70 plus hours exploring the zone, which is now a seamless connected world featuring all of the maps from all of the previous Stalker games combined into one, which is pretty impressive. While the story itself is somewhat hard to follow and maybe not the most engaging for the bulk of the experience, it is noticeably more cinematic, which personally I really appreciate. It's the moment-to-moment exploration of the world that does the heavy lifting though. Similarly to something like Red Dead Redemption 2, it's an experience defined by the organic discoveries made throughout this beautiful but dangerous world, and these intense skirmishes that threaten to impede your progress, all the while dealing with basic survival necessities such as hunger, thirst, radiation, encumbrance, etc. Honestly, if you're not a fan of survival games, it's kinda hard to recommend, because it ultimately makes this one of the most demanding and punishing shooters out there, but that's what fans have come to expect from the series. Speaking of which, the things that fans typically associate with Stalker all remain intact here. The signature use of tossing mechanical bolts to identify and avoid anomalies out in the world is just as weird as ever, and hidden artifacts that are scattered throughout the world can be found and equipped to activate various effects or stat boosts. And of course, there's also this large variety of weaponry which can be fully upgraded and modded, allowing for a lot of control over the experience you want to have. At the end of the day, Stalker 2 manages to have its cake and eat it too, I think. They took a highly respected but niche first-person shooter and gave it an extreme glow-up, catapulting it into the mainstream. Against all odds, it upholds the franchise's tradition of being one of the most unique and demanding shooters out there. It's far from perfect, but I assure you there isn't much out there quite like it. It's also maybe the only kind of shooter I'm genuinely interested in playing these days, and for that, I think it's worthy of praise. Okay, I've said this a lot in the past few years, but it's still relevant and true. Survival horror is experiencing a bit of a renaissance right now, and 2024 is definitely no exception, especially in the world of classic retro-style games. Conscript is a pitch-perfect love letter to PlayStation 1 era survival horror games in which you play a French soldier who is struggling to find his brother amidst the chaos and horrors of World War I, specifically the Battle of Verdun. It's an idea that works remarkably well because of how they let the design be influenced by the setting and the concept instead of the other way around. Disease-ridden rats, chemical warfare, and even battles at the front line all provide their own mechanical layers to the game and make for a deeply rewarding experience. It's a game that taps into the PS1 era of survival horror effortlessly, but with a lot of modern quality of life features that we can't live without, and maybe less of the awkward rigidity that the era was known for. It's a game where movement and timing mean a lot. Ammo is tight, so I found myself relying heavily on fragile melee weapons, and for those to be effective in a Warzone, timing and positioning to the enemy is imperative. But man, landing blows against enemies in this game feels so good, and when you throw in the use of grenades and the tactile nature of the guns in that era, I can't help but feel like this game might low-key be one of the best feeling games of the year. But it is a survival game above all else. You have to manage stamina, limited ammo, inventory space, and yes, even save items, an homage to the ink ribbon system of classic Resident Evil. All the while, a well-fleshed out set of accessibility options does give you tight control over the kind of experience you want to have, which is always welcome. Taking the time to fully explore the map yields really cool surprises like rare mortar shells that can be used to obliterate obstacles and open new paths or clear dangerous areas of enemies before progressing. The trenches and war-torn countryside that serve as the backdrop are beautifully crafted from a technical standpoint, but they come with a layer of grit and grime that's inevitably linked to war. This is one of the most oppressive games I've ever played, quite frankly, but the story weaves beautifully in between horrific war zones and brief flashbacks to the idyllic home of the two brothers before they're shipped off to the war. These pockets of serenity serve as a much-needed contrast to the overwhelmingly bleak environments in the rest of the game. But the true beauty is how they manage to capture the essence of survival horror without resorting to supernatural twists or otherworldly monsters. The horrors of war and the human condition are more than enough. Simply put, technically and artistically, I found Conscript to be a completely formed thought, one that kept me on the edge of my seat and firmly addicted to the classic puzzle-like nature that I typically associate with the best games in the genre. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle climbed through the rankings for me for a number of reasons. For one, the team at Machine Games built a game that feels a lot like Dishonored of all things, but when you think about the bigger picture, I think this game is noteworthy because, quite frankly, they just don't make games like this much anymore. The era of B-tier movie tie-ins has long since ended, so when something like this comes along, I'm usually rather skeptical. Luckily, the trend in recent years has shifted, and now it's less about syncing with box office hype and more about carefully constructed uses of a license. It gives strong Escape from Butcher Bay energy, which I think speaks for itself, but it certainly stands on its own as well. Now, I really enjoyed Machine Games' new take on the Wolfenstein games, but I was a little hesitant to see them step so far outside of their comfort zone with Indiana Jones. Notably, though, it is still an excellent excuse to kill and maim Nazis, so in some ways, they definitely stayed in their lane. But that's besides the point. In almost every other way, it ended up being a risk worth taking because the result is quite honestly the best Indiana Jones adventure in a very long time, easily surpassing the last two films and all the other games that have taken a shot at it since the turn of the century. Like any good Indiana Jones story, it's rooted in mystery, cultural curiosity, and at times, romance. It's got everything. Even an incredibly impressive performance from Troy Baker as Indiana Jones that sounds remarkably similar to Harrison Ford. The jump from film to game feels about as seamless as one can hope. While it certainly takes cues from obvious inspirations like the film franchise and the Uncharted series to capture that sense of wonder and adventure, it's the systems-driven, immersive sim gameplay that really elevates it. It's built around stealth, but it ensures you can deal with any situation in any number of ways using disguises, guns, and of course, Indy's signature whip. This is not some on-rails action game that tells a fun story and then sends you on your way in about 5 or 6 hours. Instead, it's broken into expansive chapters that are non-linear, fully explorable, and filled with secrets and Easter eggs to uncover. I tried to do as much as I could in this game, and I hit credits near the 40-hour mark, spending upwards of 10 plus hours exploring some of the game's larger areas. At the end of the day, it's not perfect. In fact, it has its fair share of open-world jank, questionable AI, and awkward platforming moments, but it's all in the interest of prioritizing player freedom and trust. It's a game that makes you feel capable and smart, and that is far too rare these days. It's a game I recommend to everyone, but more importantly, it feels like the type of game I hope we see more of in the years to come.
What does this say?
If I am being honest, I never had a lot of faith in Stellar Blade. Ahead of its release, and even post-demo, it reeked of gratuitous objectification, and I couldn't help but feel that the game itself would be little more than a flimsy and probably shallow excuse to ogle sexy ladies. Now don't get me wrong, I don't find this offensive or anything, I just wanted there to be a game under there, something to justify the price tag and the time commitment, and to make the whole thing feel less weird. Besides, Bayonetta set the bar pretty high for mixing sex appeal and character action, so the odds were kind of stacked against Stellar Blade, to say the least. So color me surprised when I discovered that underneath the fairly generic sci-fi lore and ridiculous sex-crazed character designs, there was an interesting world to explore, a deep combat system, and an increasingly beautiful cinematic action game lying in wait. It was literally a game that I expected to deliver the bare minimum. Instead, it hypnotized me with one of my favorite soundtracks of the year, and coerced me into falling for its flashy, hypersexualized, but ultimately more than competent combat system. Fights are frenetic, demanding, and yes, titillating at times, but when you take the skill tree, experience system, and steadily increasing power fantasy into account, it all comes together and works really, really well. By the end of the game, I was moving and reacting at a pace that would at the very least draw comparisons to something like Sekiro. While the game occasionally leads you down linear paths, it never feels small or claustrophobic, quite the contrary actually. In between linear levels, the game lets you explore a large hub city and throws you into multiple wide-open explorable zones, giving you a lot of time to explore each area to find various crafting or upgrade materials, and, most importantly, a plethora of alternate outfits and haircuts for Eve, aka the real reason this game made my list. Kidding aside, the story itself may seem like standard sci-fi nonsense, but it did eventually manage to win me over. It's a technical showpiece with a lot of cinematic flair, but perhaps more importantly, if you're a fan of slow-mo action moments, melodramatic anime nerd shit, and shooting giant laser cannons while fighting alien beasts in the vacuum of space, this might be a game for you. It demolished my low expectations and proved to be a complete package that any fan of the character action genre should be excited to play. While it may seem a tad crass on the surface, the story and the world they crafted are anything but. Give this one a chance, I don't think you'll be disappointed. Undoubtedly the year's biggest twist, Bloober Team's remake of Silent Hill 2, a bona fide horror classic and one of my favorite games of all time. Not only avoided becoming the final nail in Silent Hill's coffin and demolishing the studio's reputation, it energized the series and became a massive success story for Konami and the studio. Bloober is a team known for smaller budget horror games that have seen varying degrees of success, so I was a little nervous about handing them the keys to the kingdom, but as it turns out, it was a gamble that paid off in spades. From the opening moments of this game, when James Sunderland steps out of that grungy roadside bathroom and stares out over the lake at Silent Hill, I felt something that I hadn't felt for the series since Team Silent's last entry in 2004. The mood, the vibes, the performances, they were all immaculate, and it left an immediate good impression. And then it's followed by a nearly pitch-perfect descent into hell where they never seem to falter or miss a beat. And let's be real, we were all expecting them to fumble the ball at some point. But nearly 20 hours later, the credits rolled and I was left with my jaw on the floor. Those crazy bastards did it. They really, really did it. But Silent Hill 2 has always been great, so I wouldn't blame you for wanting to give most of the credit to the bones that they already had to work with. But for those who truly remember, the strengths and improvements made by Bloober in this case become apparent pretty quickly. The dense fog that shrouds the open streets of Silent Hill no longer serves as a technical crutch, and instead now immerses you in the unsettling world in a way that feels fully realized. Cutscenes and dialogue have been rewritten and re-recorded to a surprising degree, and the results are nothing short of impressive. Interior spaces, especially in major areas such as the apartments or hospital, have not only been completely redesigned, but also expanded dramatically, and again, the results are fantastic. The game is littered with secret but clever nods to a series that now has a much longer history than it did in 2002. It even has obtuse, self-referential Easter eggs that specifically hint at moments or puzzles from the original game that have been removed or otherwise changed. Everywhere I looked, there was this sense of deep appreciation and respect for the original work that I think is crucial in a project like this. But perhaps the most dramatic and obvious improvement is, of course, the combat. I love and adore this series, but I have never described it as fun to play, quote-unquote. Combat has been stiff, shallow, and unsatisfying since day one, but this remake changes everything. Taking cues from the Resident Evil 2 remake, the camera has been pulled back over the shoulder, a dodge button has been added, and a lot of work has been done making every melee impact and gunshot feel impactful. Enemy AI has been improved, giving them the ability to hide, ambush, or even retreat into the shadows to get an advantage. Even boss fights have been completely redesigned so that they all have their own unique twist that makes them fun and interesting to engage with. And they did all this, in my opinion, without sacrificing any of the identity of the original. The result is a game that looks and feels notably different from the game that inspired it, yet still, miraculously, feels faithful in almost every conceivable way. It's confident, methodically paced, beautifully presented, and appropriately heavy. Perhaps most importantly, the story of James Sunderland's search for his dead wife is handled with the utmost respect and feels just as relevant and impactful 23 years later. Honestly, there's no way around it. What Bloober has accomplished here is worthy of praise and celebration. They succeeded against all odds. Silent Hill 2 is not only a phenomenal remake, it now represents the absolute best that this series has to offer, and opens the door for what is hopefully a bright future for this troubled series. It's also my game of the year for 2024. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. We hope you'll join us in 2025 for a hopefully brighter year in the games industry. In a perfect world, that would mean fewer layoffs, fewer games, and zero crunch. Fingers crossed. Either way, we'll be covering it on 4Player Podcast. Join us in Discord and catch new episodes every Tuesday night on Twitch. Cheers.